Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining our session on Grantseeker Best Practices. I'm Adriana Jimenez. I'm the Director of Grants Management at the ASPCA, and we are a grants team of 4 people, and we're very excited to introduce our session today on how to help you improve your organization's best practices. This is Bina, who is actually in the room with us today. She's part of our grants team as well. So we have a bit of material to cover today, so we're going to ask you to leave your questions for the end. We are going to spend a bit of time talking about best practices, and we're going to focus on what is the difference between regulatory compliance and funder requirements. A lot of times these get lumped together, and it's important to understand the difference, so we're going to spend some time on that. Then we're going to have you go over an exercise case study that we came up with. Hopefully it'll be fun. And then we're going to give you some additional resources that you can use on your own after the session if you need more information. And finally, we're going to conclude with understanding how going beyond compliance and understanding these best practices can ultimately help you and your organization to succeed. So for the goals, today we're going to talk a lot about what are the best practices, but we want to go beyond that. We want to talk about who are these best practices for? Who decides what is a best practice? And most importantly, why are these best practices put in place? And how are they going to help you succeed, you be good at the programmatic and mission-related work that you are already so great at? And why these requirements and compliance issues are not just boring legal things that we need to do, but really that they're all set up in place to help you succeed as a nonprofit or government entity or whatever you might be set up to do. They will ultimately help the animals and help you do your work better. So with that, the first distinction I want to make is that whenever we are collecting information as funders and we set requirements in place, there's a key distinction for what best practices are. There are things that are mandated by law externally by regulators, and this can be anyone from the IRS at the federal level, or depending on where you're located, your state attorney general or other state agencies, or your local government. There might be other regulators such as auditors. These are things that are externally mandated, and sometimes they're legally mandated. And then there are requirements that funders put in place, and these can vary greatly depending on the funder, but that they are internal policies and procedures specific to that funder organization. So those are things that might be helping that funder achieve their own strategies, but are not necessarily must-haves from a legal compliance perspective. We're going to focus today on foundations because foundations, both public charities and private foundations, are also nonprofits. So a lot of the things that fall under this first bucket of regulators are also going to be things that funders need to comply with. So there's a reason that funders are collecting that information, but it is different from the information that they're collecting for their own policies and procedures reasons. And understanding that difference is really important, is really going to help you to have a better relationship with your funder, is going to help you succeed because there'll be more transparency and accountability, and there'll be a greater understanding of why we do things the way we do, and where there is wiggle room and flexibility in the things that you submit, and where there absolutely isn't. So regulatory compliance describes anything relating to laws, policies, regulations that any sort of agency, overseeing body puts in place. And as we mentioned, some of the examples we're going to cover are federal, state, local governments, and auditors. The most important category at the most basic fundamental level for nonprofit organizations to be in compliance is to understand the rules around IRS requirements. In order to classify as a 501c3 public charity, you had to already have gone through the process of filing your paperwork with the IRS and proving that you have a charitable purpose, which means that there is no private benefit in the work that you do. The money is being redistributed in your own organization and back to the community, and isn't going to a particular shareholder or somebody who's going to profit from that, and that you have a broad-based support. And once you file that, it isn't just like you're done and the work is done. There are certain requirements that you need to maintain in order to maintain that nonprofit status. At the most basic level, you need to file your annual 990 tax return. And Michael, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about the 990 and the different types of 990s.
Sure. So with 990s, generally speaking, there are going to, well, not generally speaking, actually speaking, there will be, depending on the size of your organization's budget, it will determine, or basically what your revenue is, how much, it will determine which 990 you will file. So there's the regular 990, which is a long form 990 tax return that includes a whole lot of information about your organization, not just financial information, but other information as well. And then there's also a 990EZ, which is a short form 990. And then there's a 990N. And a 990N is also known as the postcard 990. And really all it is a method to verify to the IRS that you're still functioning. It's just letting them know that you're still around. With the 990N, because it doesn't have any information about your organization other than the fact that you're still around, we actually recommend that you file the 990EZ or a regular 990 simply because that gives you an opportunity to present information about your organization to the outside world that they might not otherwise have. A lot of funders, when they're looking for information about your organization, if they're considering you for a grant, the first place they go is GuideStar. And the reason they go to GuideStar is because of two reasons. Number one, there's information on GuideStar about your organization, or at least there is the possibility of information being there. And number two, that is where 990s are posted. Once they've been submitted to the IRS, then they go to GuideStar. GuideStar posts them on your profile on their website. And so funders will often go to GuideStar as a first stop to find information out about your organization, not only on your profile, but also from the 990 itself. So if you're only filing a 990N and you're a small enough organization that you can do that, that's fine. But you can see where it would be advantageous to you to give more information by filing the 990EZ or the regular 990. And another thing that we recommend is to check out your profile on GuideStar.org, because many times there isn't very much information about your organization there, because it's information that you have to supply to GuideStar. And so we recommend that everyone look at their profile to see if there is information that they could be supplying to GuideStar. The more information you give, the better the chance you stand of getting a grant.
That's okay.
With GuideStar, to access all that information, do you have to join it?
So the question is if you need to join GuideStar in order to access that information. You don't, but just by nature of being a 501c3, you will be on GuideStar. It's basically a third-party verification website for nonprofit organizations. So just by the nature of being registered as a 501c3 nonprofit, you're already on GuideStar. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything by filing it through that way that could potentially hurt an organization and keep them from getting a grant? Or in general, is it more positive than negative?
Well, so the question is whether or not, if it can be harmful to submit information to GuideStar, if that can in any way be harmful towards getting a grant. The only way is if, let's say, you had embezzlement at your organization and you admitted to it, then yes, that could potentially hurt you. But then again, hiding it could as well. But no, actually, as a rule, it's the more information that's there, the better. And part of the reason is because for 501c3 nonprofits, it's assumed that because you have been vetted by your donors, essentially, that you are essentially more vetted than a private organization. And so so any kind of disclosure that you give is going to be in line with rules of transparency or standards of transparency. And essentially, the more transparent you are, the better. So that's really what funders are going to be looking for, is transparency. So if they check out your profile on GuideStar and there isn't much information, they might be less apt to give you a grant just because there's less information there. The more information they have, the more they're able to make a decision about giving you a grant. And if they need to follow up with you about information that they find on GuideStar, they at least know what questions to ask you.
Absolutely, and the reason all of these forms are put online and that they're made available is that there is this expectation that as public charities, we are transparent and accountable, so the more information that's out there, the better. On these forms, there are a host of different policies that are made available to the public that will help you be guided towards best practices. Some of them are mandatory, such as managing conflicts of interest actively and ensuring that you have not only policies but also procedures in place to identify conflicts of interest and manage them if they arise. Examples of that are maintaining boards that have independent board members, and what we mean by that is that your board members should not be related either as family or as a professional business interest. And that's something that we come across sometimes in newly formed organizations. Something that people don't understand when they start a new organization is they'll get their spouse or maybe their cousin or their business partner and they say, let's start a nonprofit, can you be on the board? That's generally not a best practice. We recommend that everybody's independent. That way everybody's best interests are in the interest of the organization and not theirs first. So that's one example. Another example would be avoiding any financial relationships where somebody on staff or board might benefit from a relationship, either with a vendor or some sort of transaction, business transaction that the nonprofit makes, shouldn't benefit somebody financially. The 990 will also ask you about following rules and limitations around lobbying. We will get into that on our next slide. Nonprofits can lobby. You also need to maintain minutes for board and committees meetings. And there are other policies that are not necessarily required, but that are good to have, especially if you're an organization of a certain size. Policies around record and document retention, around compensation of your executive director and senior staff. It's very good to look at comparables for other similar organizations and similar staff, what they are making in the field. You want to make sure that you're competitive, but you don't want to pay someone so much that it's at the expense of the organization and the programmatic work. Lobbying. There's still generally a misconception around some people that nonprofits can't lobby. That is not true. It's okay for 501c3s to lobby, and in fact, it's encouraged, especially in this day and age. It can be a really useful tool to help you accomplish your goals and to move the field forward. Lobbying is defined as activities that attempt to influence specific legislation. The reason that people often think they can't lobby is because they might confuse it with political activity, which is absolutely prohibited. 501c3s of any kind cannot engage in political activity. That is different from lobbying. That actually pertains to supporting a specific candidate for office or donating to a campaign. That we can't do, otherwise we risk losing our tax-exempt status.
So can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm part of a 501c3 nonprofit animal welfare organization, and there is a local politician who is running for office, and they're very, very supportive of the policies that we support as an animal welfare nonprofit, can I actively support that candidate as a candidate for that position? Or can I only advocate for the policies, or what can I do if I want to show support for that candidate but not endanger my 501c3 status?
We can't endorse candidates if they're running for office. If they're already elected, then we can lobby, and we'll look at the distinction in the next slide between lobbying and advocacy. But if that person's already in office and you want to support his legislation, then that's okay. But you cannot support his campaign or trying to endorse him if he's not in office.
Okay.
Him or her.
Is that clear to everyone, the difference? Okay. Yep.
About employees, like that work for an organization and they're actively involved in, political aspects, are they okay as long as they're not dropping our name, like the organization's name? Can they, as an individual, contribute and stuff like that without?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And we encourage you to.
So just the question there was whether or not an employee of an animal welfare nonprofit can advocate for a specific candidate. That's okay as long as they're not actually representing the organization that they work for.
Exactly.
What if that politician was coming to an event of yours, or speaking at your event? Where's that line?
That's a good question. So if a politician's coming to, let's say you're doing a fundraiser or some other, like an adoption event, and you've asked that politician to, or maybe the politician has asked to make some remarks. If that is during a campaign season, that might be different than at other times. Can you elaborate on that?
I mean, if that person is speaking at a conference and they're not saying anything specific to their candidacy, then it might be okay. But if you're actively endorsing them as part of that, it can get a little tricky. So
it's probably best to be really careful. If it's during a campaign season, when that person is actually up for office, you probably want to be really careful about whether or not you're giving that person the microphone at one of your own events. Would that be a correct answer?
Yes.
Okay.
There are two ways for nonprofits to, from a procedural perspective, be engaged in lobbying. One is known as the no substantial part test, and the other one is called the 501H election. This is basically just how you register to engage in lobbying. The no substantial part test was for many years the only option for 501c3s who did lobbying, and it basically means what it sounds like. It means that it's a way of putting a limit on how much 501c3s can lobby. There are limits. We cannot have a 501c3 that's set up exclusively for lobbying, because then it would have to be classified as something else, most likely a 501c4 or a different type of organization. Therefore, there are limits. So the no substantial part test is a rule that the IRS put in place to show and say that the activities you conduct, either measured in terms of time or dollars, the lobbying portion cannot be a substantial part of what you do. Because this was so vague and nobody knows what substantial means, and that's very subjective, in the 70s, in 1976, the IRS put in place this other option, which is called the 501H election. And you can see that here on the 990, there's a question about whether your organization engaged in lobbying or you have a 501H election. That is a much more specific way to measure how much time or dollars your organization is spending on lobbying. And there's no right or wrong answer as to which one is better. They're just different depending on your needs. The 501H election is based on the size of your organization's revenue, and I believe the cap is $1 million regardless of the size. Very important. All lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. What this means is that another thing that gets conflated with lobbying is advocacy. Lobbying is a type of advocacy. Advocacy is a very broad umbrella under which many types of activities can get classified. It deals with general issues that are objective, nonpartisan. It tries to educate, create awareness. It can be related to organizing or even voter registration. None of that is lobbying. Lobbying is one specific type of advocacy that tries to influence specific legislation, either for or against a legislation that is either in existence and trying to get changed, or trying to pass or not pass a legislation. So that would be the key distinction. If there is not a specific piece of legislation involved, then it is not lobbying, and you have no limits on how much you can advocate for an issue. So that's really good news. There's a lot that nonprofits can do to get the voice out. here are some puppies voicing their opinion about something. They can do that as much as they want. The other key distinction is that this has to do only with legislative bodies, whether at the federal, state, or local levels. But if you are dealing with any government entity at any level, if it's just an administrative regulatory agency, that also doesn't count as lobbying because they don't have legislative authority. So if you're talking to the EPA or the USDA, to somebody who works there, and you're expressing a view on something, that would not count as lobbying either. Lobbying has limits, as we talked about. You cannot lobby with federal funds either. So if you got a federal grant, you cannot use that money to lobby. Or if you work at a federal agency, you can't lobby, but other government entities can lobby. There are two types of lobbying, direct and grassroots. Direct lobbying is communication with the legislator that expresses a view about a specific legislation. So here, Michael, you might know where this is. Actually, we have Lobbying Day.
Yeah, so there are a lot of, all over the country, there's usually a lobby day for a variety of different topics, including animal welfare. So in New York State, I don't think this is there, this is somewhere else maybe, but in New York State, there's a lobby day that is usually sponsored either by HSUS or the ASPCA, and that's where anyone from whether you're just a regular citizen or you represent an animal welfare organization, you can actually go to the Capitol on a specified day and meet with your representatives and in the assembly or in the state legislature and lobby for specific legislation that is being considered.
And then there's grassroots lobbying, which is communication with the public. So it's not your organization that's directly communicating with the legislator. It's your organization getting other people to go and communicate with legislators. And very important, there has to be a call to action. What we mean by a call to action is that you have to tell those people who you're communicating with to take action on a specific piece of legislation. So this website is an example of a wildlife issue, and they're telling you to take action on this Antiquities Act of 2018, support it, and give us your signature so you can sign this petition. That's the call to action. If they were just providing this information, it wouldn't be lobbying. But there's the call to action. So if this were your website, you would have to calculate that in your lobbying expenses. And this is quite common. I'm sure you run across websites like this all the time that say, click here to contact your legislator, click here to support this piece of legislation. All of those are examples of lobbying. Compliance at the state and local levels. This, as the name implies, varies by state and by locality. So we don't have time to go into all the details in this session. But what we did want to point out is that depending on where your nonprofit is incorporated, there might be requirements in addition to what the IRS stipulates that might be slightly different. Not that there's a whole other additional range of requirements that you need to comply with, but they're usually very similar, but the thresholds might be a little different, or there might be different forms you have to file. So it's very important to check with your local and state entities to see if there's anything additional you need to do to be in compliance. And there's also certain states, if you're doing fundraising across multiple states, that require you to actually register in those states before you're allowed to fundraise there. We're giving the example here of the New York State. Are there any of you from New York State in the room? Okay, great. In New York State, it's under the purview of the Attorney General's office, and specifically the Charities Bureau, to oversee the good governance practices of nonprofits. And again, these rules are very similar to the federal rules, but some of them vary. In 2013, they passed the New York Nonprofit Revitalization Act, also known as NPRA. And this was really good because it was meant to reduce unnecessary and expensive regulatory burdens on nonprofits and to strengthen nonprofit governance and accountability. So that was signed by Cuomo in 2013. And it's a very long piece of legislation, but we're going to highlight two key clauses that they changed in this, which might apply to you. The first is that there's now a mandatory conflict of interest policy under New York law, which requires organizations to have their trustees and key employees and officers filling out a form to disclose annually whether or not they have conflicts of interest with the organization. And this is meant so that everybody is making sure they keep the organization's best interests and comply with applicable laws rather than, again, what we said earlier with making any personal gains before the organization. And now this is required by law. So if you don't already have a process in place to do that and document that, I would encourage you to do that. And you can take a look at the law on the AG's website as well and look at their specific procedures. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. On this next page, I'm giving an example of a board that I sit on. They have a policy for conflict of interest that is handed out to board members when they join the board. And we read that once we join, and then all that the organization does is once a year they send board members this really easy survey monkey, which just has the signature field and the date. And we just have to sign this and certify that we don't have any conflicts of interest. And that if we do, we need to notify the organization and let them know what that conflict is. I've worked at other organizations where the process was a bit more thorough, and we had to indicate a list each year of any organizations that we either had sat on boards of or were volunteers for. That's not required by law. Again, that's that distinction between policies that an organization requires versus what's required by law. But putting something in place can be as simple as this.
And it's really just, again, it's just a matter of providing a means for an organization and its board members or its employees to disclose conflicts of interest. So it's not meant to call out anything bad. It's just meant, again, to enhance transparency. So just an example of how this applies to us at the ASPCA. So we represent the grants department. So we give money to organizations. Sometimes there are people within the ASPCA who help us administer grants who might sit on a board of an organization that we're giving money to. So it's not that that's a bad thing, it's just that that has to be disclosed. And then we have ways of making sure that if that person shouldn't be involved in a decision-making process, we can have a proxy for that person. But again, we have to have that person disclose that they are on that organization's board so that we can make sure that we're coming up with a procedure to avoid any conflicts of interest.
Sure, and the words that's used a lot is also it's any real or perceived conflict of interest, because it may not be real, but it can be perceived as a conflict of interest. So it's very important to document those and have the proper procedures in place when there's voting around something to make sure that person is excluded. The other change that happened in the 2013 Nonprofit Revitalization Act is, and this has happened in several states, which is a really good thing, the thresholds for the nonprofits that need to submit an audited financials has been raised. It used to be that anyone who had gross income of $250,000 or above had to file an independent audit, and now that has been raised to $750,000, and the goal is to raise that to $1 million by 2021. This is really good for organizations because audits can be expensive and they're time-consuming, and if any of you has gone through the process, you know that it takes up a lot of resources and energy. So the goal was to really streamline this. There's also thresholds for the CPA review report, which is something similar to the audit, but it's less stringent. The auditors at the end don't come up with an opinion, which means that they didn't look at independent transactions. They just looked at your overall procedures and made sure that they were in agreement with GAAP, with the general accounting principles. So on that note, speaking of independent auditors, It's important to ask the question, when you're thinking about doing an audit, who are you doing it for? Audits are really valuable. We encourage them because they offer a lot of transparency and they're very accurate, and it's good to have someone external come in and review your books, and not only because there's going to be fraud necessarily, but because mistakes happen, and it's good to have an external evaluator looking at that. But it isn't always realistic for all organizations, so the two things to keep in mind and balance out are the transparency and accuracy with the cost, both money and resources and time of your organization, and is it realistic? So it's important to ask and understand when an audit is required versus when it's nice to have. Some states require it, as we just saw, based on your gross income. Depending on where you're based, I would encourage you to look at what that requirement is in your particular state. If you receive any federal or state funding, that might be a requirement in order to receive those grants or contracts. And then again, funders, some of them expect or require it, but this is where I would say, funders require it because of their own policies and procedures and not necessarily because it's required by law. So if you don't actually have to file an audit and you have a funder who says you absolutely must have this, and you consider it very burdensome for you, I would encourage you to have a conversation with that funder and ask them, is there something else we can provide instead? Can we provide compiled financials, a 990? Is there anything else that will suffice so that you don't have to go through that burdensome process? Is there anything else?
Yeah, and again, I would just say that really the point of an audit is, again, to kind of reinforce the transparency notion. So it's not necessarily that you're trying to find out something that you're doing wrong, per se, but it is actually very easy to, violate is too strong of a word, but basically to not follow a generally accepted accounting principle to the T. It's very easy to make a little mistake. And those little mistakes don't really matter materially, but the fact that you've actually then discovered that mistake in an audit will then help you correct it for the future. And so because you're able to do that in an audit, that's why funders actually prefer that you have audited financials versus non-audited, because they know that your financials are being reviewed by an external source and that you're discovering any potential mistakes that you might have that you're then able to fix. Again, it's not usually going to be anything really egregious. It's just that it's making sure that you're following the rules that you're supposed to be following.
So that's a nice segue for talking about funder requirements. These are not going to be a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately. I sit on a board called Peak Grant Making, which is all about trying to figure out how funders can work together to streamline requirements and get us all to be on the same page so that there's less things for grant seekers to submit, and no matter what, each funder has their own thing that they want, and it's always different. So it's always going to be a little different for each funder that you get grants from. But that said, there's going to be commonalities as well. So funders are at a very basic level are going to need details to evaluate your request. There's going to be a proposal narrative with supplemental information that might come in the form of photos or references. There's usually going to be financial information that's requested. Typically, that includes an annual organizational budget. And if you are requesting funds for a specific project, this is very important. There's going to be a project budget that's requested. And the project budget is probably, in addition to the narrative, one of the single most important things that a funder needs to look at in order to assess whether or not to fund your proposal and how much they should fund it for. And it's quite often the thing that's most overlooked by grant seekers, whether they don't include enough information, or one thing we see often is that there isn't a breakdown of income for the project if the funder isn't the only one who's funding it. So if you have a project that's going to cost $50,000, and you're only requesting, say, $10,000 from that funder, it's helpful for the funder to know where you're going to get the other $40,000. So including a balanced budget with income and expenses is really helpful, and to get us a picture of who your other funders are, how you're going to make up the balance of the budget. Again, annual financial statements are great to have if they're available, but if not, we can work around that. The IRS Form 990 is something we can pull off GuideStar easily, but some funders can also collect it. They prefer to collect it on their online application. If you're a government entity, other forms can substitute that, such as a W-9. And the other really important thing is for the funder to do an EIN verification and make sure that you are a charitable organization. And there might be other requirements, such as site visits or just phone calls, and the signed contract, of course. When you have a signed contract with the funder, never be afraid to ask if there's something that you absolutely need to change on there, or if there's something that your organization is not okay with. There's always room for flexibility there. After a grant is awarded, the work doesn't end there, so there's going to be additional due diligence to make sure that there's transparency and accountability. That's the purpose of collecting interim reports, final financial reports. There might be additional check-ins that funders require. And then there are always special circumstances in cases where a grant doesn't exactly go according to timeline, or the project doesn't pan out as intended, or it might be that it's really successful and you need more funds to scale it, or whatever it might be. It's quite often that we get requests for extensions to complete the work, or some sort of modification to do something slightly differently than what was originally proposed. Or grants need to be canceled sometimes. It doesn't mean that the project has failed or that your organization has failed. It just means that it's a learning opportunity and that something didn't go according to plan. But we always prefer honesty, transparency, good relationship than having to hide things and hear that everything's going great if maybe there was a challenge. So we thought it might be fun to do, we don't have a whole lot of time, but we thought it might be fun to do a little case study. I'm just going to read out this hypothetical case study and ask you for your opinion on whether or not you think this proposal would be funded. So your organization, your 501c3 nonprofit, the Sebastian Pet Rescue, submits a proposal to the BINA Foundation requesting $20,000 over 12 months. The requested project funds would support advocacy efforts to increase awareness around animal homelessness in your county. This is your second request to the BINA Foundation, which awarded you $10,000 the prior year for a similar project that has had a high success rate, impacting hundreds of animals. However, you have not been able to submit your final report to the BINA Foundation, which was due 6 months ago, due to a leadership transition at your organization. The executive director stepped down. The change in executive director also caused some delays in filing your 990 tax return, and the tax forms on GuideStar are now 2 years outdated. The BINA Foundation is a national funder, and animal homelessness is their primary area of focus. The funder specifies on their guidelines that they do not provide any funding for lobbying grants, except in the case of general operating support. So the question is, and you could take a few minutes to think about it, do you think this request will be funded by the BINA Foundation? Why or why not? And just some ideas, what do you consider to be some strengths and weaknesses about this request and of the organization in the context of this specific request?
So there's a lot of information in this case study, and so there really isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. There are basically a lot of right answers, and so we're just kind of curious to know what your thoughts are based on the information there, whether or not you think this would be funded, and again, why or why not, and then what are the strengths and weaknesses of the request? Anyone?
questions?
Why did the ED step down?
We don't know. The question was why did the ED step down? We don't know why the ED stepped down. We just know that they did, and that was the cause of the delay in reporting.
But that's kind of where what we're getting at is like if you were the funder, you might ask those questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it would really depend on the communication that the organization had with the foundation all along the way. You know, if they kind of said, oh, okay, we're delayed for X, Y, and Z, and the foundation said that's okay, keep going, we support your work. So if there'd been a good relationship all along, I think they've got a better shot. If not, I would think that they would want to hold on to that application until they had things in better.
Great.
Yep.
Communication and honesty is key.
I would say no. Is this working? I would say no, just because the fact that there is no record of where this money was actually going, this $10,000, because they didn't do the tax return. So there's a lot of questions financially when they're asking specifically for money. Where has that money gone? It's just, so to give them more money, it's not support or, it's just really concerning, I guess. So to invest in something where you have no idea where your money originally went to, that $10,000, why would you, make that investment again when you don't know?
Sure.
Actually, I want to shift the perspective a little bit on this particular case study. So if you were distributing these grants, right, and there was, I understand that in a situation where there's stiff competition for these grants, you might not necessarily go with the nonprofit described in this case study, but what if there was no competition in the real world? Would you actually consider something like this? Or if there is not too much competition, are you sort of under any constraints to distribute money?
So okay, if this were a request that came to us, I would probably do some more research to find out why, for example, why was there the delay, and if I already knew as the funder, if I already knew that this organization had a previous track record in doing good work for the causes that my foundation supports. I'm probably not going to want to just disregard this request. I'm probably going to want to do some follow-up. My hope is that in their application for support, that they would actually disclose some of the reasons why there are some deficiencies in their application. But even if they don't, communication is a two-way street. It can come from the applicant or it can come from the funder. And so I think from my perspective, I tend to, in my own experience doing grant making, I tend to give the benefit of the doubt to the applicant, and I recognize that sometimes they don't always know what information they need to disclose to me, and so I might engage in a conversation with them to find out what information I need to know in order to make a qualified decision. It could be that in the end, I do want to give them a grant because I know that they can do the work, but I might have some reservations. And so there are some tools that we as funders can use to make sure that that we're minimizing our risk with that particular organization. And so one of those things could be that we withhold payment or part of the payment until certain benchmarks have been met. So we might say, okay, this is going to be a grant for 1 year. We're going to pay you half of the grant up front to do some of the work. We need certain benchmarks to be met by, let's say, 5 or 6 months that you need to report back on. And then as long as we're satisfied that you've met those benchmarks, then we'll give you the rest of the payment. So there are different tools like that. And ideally, funders will work with organizations to make sure that, that the work is getting done in the most optimal way and meeting the goals that are set out by both the funder and the applicant. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a great way of explaining it. I think a lot of the onus is also on the funder to do additional due diligence when there's a red flag or a question about something that's not clear, or I think not filing a report or 990 shouldn't necessarily be the grounds for dismissing someone or not funding someone, but it is a signal to do additional due diligence. And that's a responsibility that funders have if somebody's doing good work and they have a good track record. We wanted to provide a couple of additional resources in case you're not familiar with these already. There's the Foundation Centers. The Foundation Directory Online is a great tool, database that allows you to search for grant makers by location, by field of interest. It's free, or you can upgrade to have a professional account that allows you to access much more information. This is an example of kind of a snapshot of what they provide. We already talked about GuideStar. Your information will be on there automatically, but if you can be proactive in maintaining your account and uploading information, funders love that. It's great for you, the public too, to maintain transparency. BoardSource is a great resource to help your board development. And then there's the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which is a membership organization that you can be involved with, and they have all sorts of resources and events. And then there's the Alliance for Justice and a project they have called Boulder Advocacy. This is the go-to place for everything related to lobbying and advocacy, and they have a great blog and great resources, and it explains everything you need to know about lobbying. They even have this calculator if you have the 501H election that allows you to calculate what your lobbying expenses are. So we encourage you to use that. And just to conclude that all of this information, compliance can be really cut and dry, and all these requirements can be really onerous, and it's not the most exciting stuff sometimes to have to do like all this homework for funders and for the IRS. But we really like to make the point that all of this is put in place to, to really understand these requirements and understand who is requiring them, why, can help you to become more efficient at what you do, and therefore save time and resources to focus more of your energy on what it is that you love, which is saving animals and focusing on programmatic work and not all of this administrative stuff that is less exciting, unless you're me, which I love compliance stuff. But so yeah, it can help strengthen relationships with funders and build your networks, and the more best practices you have in place, the more you're going to succeed and help the animals and be great at the jobs that you are already fantastic at. So, great.
We don't really have any more time, but we can stay if you do have any questions for us. All right, then, thank you.